You and I both know those tables are empty. What's the real problem here?
The thing is, this restaurant is not a place for people.
Disabled veteran denied service at restaurant. Then his platoon turned it into a battlefield. The evening rush at Riverside Grill was in full swing when Staff Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Williams rolled through the front door in his wheelchair, his prosthetic legs visible beneath his carefully pressed khakis as he navigated toward what he hoped would be a quiet dinner to celebrate his daughter's acceptance to college. At 38, he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had learned to find strength in vulnerability, his missing limbs, the price he had paid for bringing his entire platoon home from an IED explosion in Afghanistan 5 years earlier. The restaurant's hostess looked at him with a kind of uncomfortable pity that he had learned to recognize the look of someone who saw disability before they saw the man. But tonight, her discomfort would escalate into discrimination that would unite his old platoon in a way that nothing had, since their discharge transforming a simple dinner into a mission that would remind everyone involved that some bonds can never be broken by distance, time, or the assumption that warriors stop fighting when they take off their uniforms. A platoon fights together, eats together, and stands together no matter what uniform they're wearing or what battles they've already won. I'm sorry, but we don't have accommodations for people like you, the hostess at Riverside Grill said, her voice carrying the polite cruelty that Marcus Williams had learned to recognize in the 5 years since losing his legs to an IED in Afghanistan. Behind her empty tables mocked the lie. Marcus "Tank" Williams gripped the wheels of his chair with hands that had once carried wounded soldiers to safety. His prosthetic legs, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for bringing his entire platoon home alive. The silver star on his jacket lapel caught the restaurant's dim lighting like a silent accusation. What happened next would prove that some battles continue long after the war is over, and that the brotherhood forged in combat doesn't end when soldiers return home. The hostess's discrimination would unite 12 combat veterans in a mission that would transform hatred into understanding. Riverside Grill sat in the heart of Millbrook, a prosperous suburb where military service was honored in theory, but often forgotten in practice. The restaurant prided itself on being a gathering place for the community's elite business leaders, politicians, and professionals who preferred their patriotism displayed on bumper stickers rather than tested through personal sacrifice. The dining room buzzed with conversations about stock portfolios and real estate investments, while servers moved between tables with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that their tips depended on maintaining the illusion of exclusivity. This was the America that Marcus had fought to protect, where freedom was celebrated but not always extended to those who had paid the highest price for it. The elegant atmosphere and expensive menu created a barrier that was economic as much as social, separating those who had served from those who had merely benefited from that service. Marcus Williams had enlisted in the Army straight out of high school, driven by a family tradition of military service that stretched back 3 generations. His father had served in Vietnam, his grandfather in Korea, and Marcus had grown up believing that defending his country was not just a job, but a calling. The nickname "Tank" had come from his ability to carry wounded soldiers to safety under fire, a skill that had saved dozens of lives during his 3 tours in Afghanistan. His leadership had been recognized with multiple commendations, But his greatest pride came from the knowledge that every soldier under his command had returned home alive. The IED that ended Marcus's military career had also ended his marriage, his wife unable to cope with the challenges of caring for a disabled veteran while raising their daughter alone. He now lived in a small apartment on his disability pension, struggling with PTSD and phantom limb pain while trying to maintain a relationship with his teenage daughter, Sarah. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. The loss of purpose, the constant pain, and the realization that the country he had served often saw him as a burden rather than a hero. His weekly dinners with Sarah were among the few bright spots in an existence that often felt more like survival than living. What made Marcus extraordinary wasn't just his military service, but his ability to inspire absolute loyalty in the soldiers who had served under him. His platoon had been like a family bound together by shared hardship and their sergeant's unwavering commitment to their safety and success. Even years after their discharge, the men and women who had served with Tank Williams remained connected through a group text that had become their lifeline to each other. His leadership style had been based on respect rather than fear, and his soldiers had followed him not because they had to, but because they trusted him completely. The central challenge Marcus faced was more complex than simple discrimination. It was the battle between his desire to live a normal life and a society that seemed determined to treat him as either a symbol or a charity case, rather than a human being. The restaurant's refusal to serve him wasn't just about accessibility. It was about the fundamental question of whether his sacrifice had earned him the right to be treated with dignity in the country he had served. The stakes extended beyond personal humiliation to encompass the broader treatment of disabled veterans in a society that praised their service while often failing to accommodate their needs. Marcus's response to this discrimination would determine not just his own future, but the message sent to every veteran struggling with the transition from warrior to civilian. His decision to fight back would test the bonds of military brotherhood and prove that some battles were worth fighting long after the war was over. The moment that would change everything came when Marcus made the decision that would define his response to discrimination. Instead of leaving quietly, he pulled out his phone and sent a message to his old platoon's group chat. The text was simple, but loaded with meaning. Need backup at Riverside Grill, civilian engagement, nonviolent resolution preferred. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, his phone buzzed with replies from across the country as his former soldiers confirmed their availability and began making travel arrangements. These weren't just casual acquaintances, they were men and women who had shared foxholes, survived firefights, and trusted each other with their lives. The brotherhood that had been forged in combat wasn't diminished by distance or time. "Tank, we're rolling," came the reply from Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, who was driving from Atlanta. "ETA 4 hours. What's the situation?" "Discrimination based on disability," Marcus replied, his fingers steady, despite the anger building in his chest. "Restaurant refuses service. Need to send a message about how we treat our own." The operation that followed would demonstrate that military tactics could be applied to civilian situations, but with the precision and discipline that separated professional soldiers from angry civilians. This wasn't about revenge, It was about justice. The strategy that emerged from the platoon's group chat was elegantly simple. They would occupy the restaurant through legitimate means, overwhelming the establishment with a coordinated display of military precision that would force the management to confront their discriminatory practices. The plan required careful coordination, but these were people who had planned complex operations under enemy fire. Lieutenant Colonel James Murphy, who had been the platoon's commanding officer, took charge of the logistics from his home in Colorado. "This is a peaceful operation," he emphasized in a conference call that included all 12 members of the platoon. "We're not there to cause trouble. We're there to make a point about how we treat our veterans." The preparation was methodical and professional. Each member of the platoon would arrive at the restaurant at staggered intervals, request tables, and proceed to order extensive meals while conducting themselves with the kind of military bearing that would be impossible to ignore. They would tip generously, be unfailingly polite, and demonstrate through their presence that veterans deserved respect rather than discrimination. "Remember," Murphy continued, "we're representing not just ourselves, but every veteran who has ever been treated like a second-class citizen. This isn't about Tank, it's about all of us." The resources required were minimal, but the coordination was complex. Hotel reservations, travel arrangements, and timing all had to be synchronized to create maximum impact while maintaining the discipline that had made them effective soldiers. The operation began at 1800 hours the following evening when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez arrived at Riverside Grill and politely requested a table for one. His appearance pressed uniform military bearing, and the kind of confidence that came from years of service immediately attracted attention from both staff and customers. "Certainly, sir," the hostess said, her tone markedly different from the one she had used with Marcus the previous night. "Right this way." Rodriguez was seated at a prominent table where his presence would be noted, and he began the process of ordering an extensive meal while maintaining the kind of military bearing that commanded respect. His order was complex and deliberate, multiple courses, wine pairings, and dessert designed to maximize his time in the restaurant while demonstrating the kind of economic impact that discriminatory practices could cost. 15 minutes later, Sergeant Santos arrived and repeated the process, followed by Corporal Johnson, then Specialist Williams. Each veteran was seated at a different table, but their coordinated presence began to create an atmosphere that the restaurant's management couldn't ignore. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The dining room was filling with people who carried themselves with military precision, their presence a reminder of service and sacrifice that the restaurant's affluent clientele couldn't dismiss or ignore. The first sign that something unusual was happening came when restaurant manager Patricia Brennan noticed that an unusually high percentage of her customers were displaying military bearing and ordering expensive meals with the kind of methodical precision that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Each veteran maintained perfect military courtesy, but their presence was creating an atmosphere that was impossible to ignore. Other diners began to notice the pattern, and conversation shifted from business deals to speculation about what was happening. The situation escalated when Marcus himself arrived at exactly 1900 hours, rolling through the front door in his wheelchair to find the same hostess who had discriminated against him the previous night. This time, however, she was faced with a dining room filled with his former soldiers, all of whom stood immediately upon his arrival in a display of military respect that sent a clear message about the bonds of brotherhood and the consequences of disrespecting a veteran. The final phase of the escalation came when Lieutenant Colonel Murphy arrived in full dress uniform and requested a table for 13, explaining that he needed to join his soldiers for a mission debrief. The request forced the restaurant to confront the reality that they were dealing with a coordinated operation by people who understood both military tactics and the power of peaceful demonstration. The dining room had been transformed into a statement about respect service and the price of discrimination. The pressure on the restaurant intensified when other diners began to understand what they were witnessing, a coordinated response to discrimination that was both peaceful and undeniably powerful. Some customers approached the veterans' tables to express their gratitude for their service, while others began photographing the scene and sharing it on social media with hashtags that would make the incident viral within hours. "This is incredible," posted one customer on Instagram. 12 veterans just staged the most dignified protest I've ever seen. They're not causing trouble, they're just showing what respect looks like. The social media attention attracted local news crews who arrived to find a story that was both heartwarming and emblematic of broader issues facing veterans. The image of Marcus, surrounded by his former soldiers, all of them conducting themselves with military precision while enjoying an expensive meal, became a powerful symbol of brotherhood and the fight for dignity. Restaurant management found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't remove the veterans without appearing to discriminate against people who had served their country. But the coordinated presence was clearly a response to their treatment of Marcus the previous evening. The breakthrough in Marcus's personal journey came when he realized that his individual struggle with discrimination had become a catalyst for his platoon to demonstrate the values they had fought to protect. Watching his former soldiers rally around him with the same dedication they had shown in combat, he began to understand that his disability didn't diminish his worth or his ability to lead. "Tank," whispered Sergeant Santos as she leaned over from the neighboring table, "this is what we do. We fight for each other, whether it's in Afghanistan or Millbrook. You brought us home from the war. Now we're bringing you home to the respect you deserve." The words hit Marcus with the force of revelation. His struggle with PTSD and phantom limb pain had made him feel isolated and forgotten. But the coordinated response of his platoon proved that the bonds forged in combat transcended physical limitations and geographical distance. As he looked around the dining room at his former soldiers, all of them conducting themselves with the kind of military bearing that commanded respect, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since his injury: pride in who he was, rather than grief for who he had been. The tension reached a breaking point when restaurant owner Robert Davidson arrived after being called by his panicked manager, his face flushed with anger, as he surveyed a dining room that had been transformed into what he clearly saw as a military occupation. Davidson was a successful businessman who had built his restaurant's reputation on exclusivity and had never been challenged by customers who refused to accept discrimination. "I don't know what kind of game you people are playing," he announced to the dining room, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who had never been held accountable for his prejudices. "But this is a private establishment, and I have the right to serve whoever I choose." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and every veteran in the room understood that they had reached the moment when diplomacy would either succeed or fail. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy stood slowly, his movement precise and deliberate, the kind of command presence that had been earned through years of leading soldiers in combat. "Mr. Davidson," Murphy said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about what's happening here." The confrontation that followed would determine whether the restaurant would learn from its mistakes or double down on discrimination that had already attracted national attention. The crisis erupted when Davidson made the catastrophic decision to call the police, claiming that his restaurant was being occupied by a group of veterans who were intimidating his other customers. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. A man who had refused service to a disabled veteran was now asking law enforcement to remove the very people who had sworn to protect and defend the Constitution he was hiding behind. "Officers," Davidson said when 2 patrol cars arrived, "these people are disrupting my business. They're clearly coordinating some kind of protest, and I want them removed from my property." The police officers, both of whom were veterans themselves, found themselves in an impossible position. They were being asked to remove people who were conducting themselves with perfect military courtesy, ordering expensive meals and tipping generously while demonstrating the kind of respect for authority that law enforcement appreciated. Officer Michael Chen, a Marine veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq, surveyed the scene with the eye of someone who understood both military bearing and civilian rights. "Sir," he said to Davidson, "these people are customers who are paying for their meals and conducting themselves appropriately. What exactly do you want us to charge them with?" The question exposed the fundamental flaw in Davidson's strategy. The veterans weren't breaking any laws or causing any disturbances. They were simply existing in a space where they had been unwelcome, and their presence was a powerful statement about dignity and respect that couldn't be criminalized. But Davidson's call to police had also escalated the situation beyond what anyone had anticipated, transforming a peaceful demonstration into a potential confrontation that could have consequences far beyond the restaurant. The moment of truth came when Officer Chen approached Lieutenant Colonel Murphy and quietly explained that while no laws were being broken, the restaurant owner was claiming that the veteran's presence was a form of harassment that was driving away other customers. The conversation that followed would determine whether the situation would escalate into a legal confrontation or resolve through the kind of military leadership that had kept the platoon together through 3 tours of combat. Colonel Chen said, his voice carrying the respect that one veteran gave to another, "I don't see any violations here, but the owner is insisting that you're disrupting his business. Is there a way we can resolve this without anyone getting arrested?" Murphy's response demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that had made him an effective leader in combat. "Officer, we're customers who are paying for our meals and conducting ourselves appropriately. But more importantly, we're here because one of our own was discriminated against last night based on his disability. This isn't about disrupting business, it's about demanding the respect that veterans have earned." The explanation transformed the situation from a simple trespassing complaint into a civil rights issue that the police couldn't ignore. Chen found himself caught between his duty to enforce the law and his understanding of the discrimination that had triggered the veteran's response. "What do you want to happen here?" Chen asked his question, directed at both Murphy and Davidson. The answer would determine whether the situation would escalate into arrests and legal proceedings, or whether it would become an opportunity for education and understanding that could benefit everyone involved. The decision that would define everything came when Marcus himself wheeled forward to address both the police officers and the restaurant owner, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had found his strength through the support of his brothers and sisters in arms. "Mr. Davidson," Marcus said, his words measured and precise, "I came to your restaurant last night to celebrate my daughter's acceptance to college. I was denied service because of my disability, because your hostess decided that people like me weren't welcome in your establishment. These are my brothers and sisters from Afghanistan, people who risk their lives to protect the freedoms that allow you to run your business. They're not here to cause trouble. They're here to show you what respect looks like." The speech was delivered with the kind of quiet dignity that commanded attention, and its impact was immediate and powerful. Other diners began to understand the full scope of what they were witnessing, while the police officers found themselves confronted with a situation that required wisdom rather than law enforcement. "We're not asking for charity," Marcus continued. "We're asking for the same respect that any customer deserves, the right to be served based on our character rather than our appearance, and the dignity that comes from being treated as human beings rather than objects of pity or discrimination." The preparation for the final confrontation required Lieutenant Colonel Murphy to draw upon every leadership skill he had developed during his military career, transforming what could have been a hostile standoff into an opportunity for education and understanding. His approach combined the tactical precision of military planning with the diplomatic skills necessary for civilian negotiations. "Officer Chen," Murphy said, addressing the veteran police officer who had become an unofficial mediator, "I'd like to propose a solution that addresses everyone's concerns. Mr. Davidson is worried about his business, and we're concerned about the treatment of veterans. What if we could turn this into something positive for everyone involved?" The proposal that followed was elegantly simple. The veterans would conclude their demonstration by hosting a fundraising dinner for local veteran organizations, with the restaurant donating a percentage of proceeds to support services for disabled veterans. The event would transform a confrontation into a celebration while demonstrating the economic impact of treating veterans with respect. "This isn't about winning or losing," Murphy explained to Davidson. "It's about finding a way forward that honors everyone's dignity while addressing the real issues that brought us here tonight." The tension reached its peak when Davidson was forced to make a decision that would define not just the immediate situation, but his restaurant's future relationship with the veteran community. The presence of police officers, news crews, and social media attention had transformed a local incident into a national story that would be impossible to ignore. "Mr. Davidson," Officer Chen said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the broader implications, "you have an opportunity here to show leadership and make things right. These veterans aren't asking for anything unreasonable. They're asking for basic respect and dignity." The restaurant owner found himself at the center of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control, with national attention focused on his response to discrimination against a disabled veteran. The social media coverage had already attracted thousands of comments, most of them critical of his establishment's treatment of Marcus and supportive of the veteran's coordinated response. "I never intended for this to happen," Davidson said his earlier arrogance replaced by the recognition that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond his restaurant. I don't know how to handle all of this. The resolution began when Marcus offered Davidson something unexpected: forgiveness, coupled with the opportunity to learn from his mistakes. The gesture was pure military leadership, demonstrating that true strength lay not in defeating enemies, but in transforming them into allies. "Mr. Davidson," Marcus said, his voice carrying the compassion that had made him beloved by his soldiers, "I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who hasn't had the opportunity to understand what veterans face when we come home. This isn't about punishing you, it's about making sure this doesn't happen to other veterans." The offer created space for dialogue that hadn't existed before, allowing Davidson to step back from his defensive posture and consider the broader implications of his actions. The breakthrough came when Davidson's own military history was revealed. His father had been a Vietnam veteran who had struggled with PTSD and discrimination issues that Davidson had never wanted to confront. The revelation that his own family had been affected by the same prejudices he was now perpetuating created a moment of recognition that transformed his understanding of the situation. "My father came home from Vietnam to protests and discrimination," Davidson said, his voice breaking as he confronted memories he had suppressed for decades. He never talked about his service, and he died believing that his country had forgotten him. "I swore I'd never let that happen to other veterans, but I guess I became part of the problem." The admission created a bridge between Davidson and the veterans that allowed for genuine dialogue about the challenges facing disabled veterans and the importance of creating inclusive environments. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary, addressing not just the immediate discrimination, but the broader cultural issues that contributed to veteran alienation. The climactic moment came when Davidson made a public apology that was both genuine and comprehensive, acknowledging not just the discrimination against Marcus, but the broader issues that had contributed to his actions. The apology was delivered in front of the assembled veterans, police officers, and news crews, making it a matter of public record that couldn't be taken back or minimized. "I owe Mr. Williams and all veterans an apology," Davidson said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. "My restaurant failed to live up to the values that these heroes fought to protect. We will be implementing new policies to ensure that all veterans receive the respect and accommodation they deserve." The apology was followed by concrete actions. The restaurant would provide monthly free meals for disabled veteran staff, would receive training on disability awareness and veteran issues, and the establishment would become a gathering place for veteran organizations. The changes represented more than just public relations. They were systemic reforms that would prevent future discrimination. The victory was measured not in the defeat of Davidson, but in his transformation from someone who perpetuated discrimination to someone who actively fought against it. The fundraising dinner that followed raised over $50,000 for local veteran organizations, while the restaurant's new policies became a model for other establishments throughout the region. "This is what winning looks like," Marcus told his daughter Sarah when she arrived to see the conclusion of the operation. "Not destroying your enemies, but helping them become better people." The media coverage that followed focused not on the confrontation, but on the reconciliation with Marcus and Davidson appearing together on national television to discuss veteran issues and the importance of creating inclusive communities. The story became a powerful example of how military values could be applied to civilian situations, transforming conflict into cooperation and discrimination into understanding. The immediate consequences of the veterans' coordinated response extended far beyond Riverside Grill to influence how restaurants and businesses throughout the region treated disabled veterans. The incident became a case study in effective protest, demonstrating how military discipline and coordination could be applied to civilian situations to achieve positive outcomes without violence or destruction. Marcus found himself transformed from an isolated disabled veteran into a recognized advocate for veteran rights with speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that gave him new purpose and meaning. The brotherhood that had sustained him through the restaurant incident became the foundation for ongoing advocacy work that would benefit veterans throughout the country. The immediate aftermath of the Riverside Grill incident brought changes that extended far beyond one restaurant to reshape how the entire region approached veteran services and accommodation. Within weeks, the story had inspired similar peaceful demonstrations at businesses that discriminated against disabled customers, creating a movement that combined military precision with civilian activism. Marcus's phone rang constantly with requests for speaking engagements, media interviews, and consulting opportunities from businesses that wanted to improve their veteran services. The platform that had been thrust upon him allowed him to turn his personal experience with discrimination into a broader advocacy mission that would benefit thousands of veterans struggling with similar challenges. The restaurant industry began implementing new training programs focused on disability awareness and veteran issues, while advocacy organizations used the incident as a model for effective nonviolent protest that achieved lasting change. The coordination and discipline displayed by Marcus's platoon became a template for veteran activism that emphasized dignity and respect over confrontation and anger. The long-term impact of the veterans' coordinated response extended far beyond individual businesses to influence policy changes at the state and federal level. The incident became a catalyst for legislation strengthening protections for disabled veterans, while the media coverage helped educate the public about the challenges facing veterans in the transition to civilian life. The training programs developed in response to the incident became standard throughout the hospitality industry, with certification requirements for businesses that wanted to advertise themselves as veteran-friendly. The economic impact was significant. Establishments that embraced inclusive policies saw increased patronage from veteran communities, while those that maintained discriminatory practices faced public pressure and boycotts. Most importantly, the incident demonstrated that military values of brotherhood, loyalty, and service could be successfully applied to civilian situations, creating positive change through disciplined action rather than destructive protest. The model developed by Marcus's platoon influenced veteran advocacy groups throughout the country, leading to more effective and dignified approaches to addressing discrimination and prejudice. The relationship between Marcus and Davidson evolved into a partnership that created ongoing programs for veteran support, with the restaurant becoming a regular meeting place for veteran organizations and a symbol of how former enemies could become allies in the fight for justice and equality. Marcus's transformation from an isolated, disabled veteran to a recognized advocate for veteran rights was profound and life-changing. The support of his platoon had reminded him that his value wasn't diminished by his disability, while the platform created by the incident gave him new purpose and meaning beyond his military service. His relationship with his daughter Sarah was strengthened by her pride in his advocacy work, while his connection with his former soldiers was renewed through their shared commitment to supporting veteran causes. The man who had once felt forgotten and discarded had become a voice for thousands of veterans facing similar challenges. The story of Marcus Williams and his platoon became a powerful reminder that the values learned in military service, loyalty, courage, and commitment to protecting others didn't end when soldiers returned home. A platoon fights together, eats together, and stands together no matter what uniform they're wearing or what battles they've already won. Marcus would say in his speeches, knowing that the brotherhood forged in combat was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, including the discrimination that too many veterans faced in the country they had sworn to protect.